40. Sarah. Some schools seek to foster a habit of volunteering in their students by requiring them to perform community service. But since a person who has been forced to do something has not really volunteered, and since the habit of volunteering cannot be said to have been fostered in a person who has not yet volunteered for anything, there is no way this policy can succeed by itself. Paul, I disagree. Some students forced to perform community service have enjoyed it so much that they subsequently actually volunteer to do something similar. In such cases, the policy can clearly be said to have fostered a habit of volunteering. The question is, Paul responds to Sarah's argument using which one of the following argumentative techniques? So we're looking at Paul's argument. Paul is disagreeing with Sarah and giving an example of cases that go against what Sarah says would happen, right, if people are forced to volunteer or required to volunteer. Let's look at the answer options. A, he argues that Sarah is assuming just what she sets out to prove. Well, Sarah sets out to prove that this policy cannot succeed by itself, right? Does she assume that and then say it? I don't think so. I think Sarah is essentially almost saying, well, since it can't happen in this way, it basically can't happen at all, right? That's kind of what Sarah's process is of reasoning through this, and that's not really what A is saying, right? Paul is not just arguing that Sarah is assuming what she sets out to prove. If Sarah was assuming just what she set out to prove, that would be circular reasoning, which is a flaw, but that does not often show up on the LSAT, but it often shows up on answer choices. B, he argues that Sarah's conception of what it means to volunteer excludes certain activities that ought to be considered instances of volunteering. I don't think Paul is talking about Sarah's definition of volunteering. Yeah, so Sarah is saying that, volunteering can only happen in a certain way, but Paul isn't saying, well, I'm going to leave B open because I think it's not really about the definition of volunteering, but it kind of is about the conception, right? Maybe the notion of volunteering, Sarah's notion of volunteering might be too narrow to have considered what Paul was considering, so I'll leave B open. C, he introduces considerations that call into question one of Sarah's assumptions. Perhaps, right? We can leave C open as well because Paul, introduces a consideration. He's like, hey, look at these students that enjoyed it so much that they actually volunteer to do something similar. And I think that questions Sarah's assumption that, just because she rejected this one thing, she's saying, well, that's it. There's no way this policy can succeed. There's no way that, people who've been required to volunteer can end up volunteering. I like C. Let's look at D. He questions Sarah's motives for advancing an argument against the school policy. Does Paul ever question Sarah's motives? Does Paul ever say something directly against Sarah or her motives? No, right? I think Paul is just saying, well, Sarah, you overlooked something, right? So we can cross out D. E, he argues that a policy Sarah fails to consider could accomplish the same aim as the policy that Sarah considers. So I don't think what Paul is talking about is a policy that Sarah fails to consider, right? He's talking about an aspect of volunteering that Sarah fails to consider. So we can cross out A for that reason. They're both talking about the same policy, right? I like C better than B. He argues that Sarah's conception of what it means to volunteer excludes certain activities. Does Sarah's understanding of volunteering necessarily exclude certain activities? Are we sure that she doesn't consider what Paul is talking about as volunteering? No, right? It's not that she's excluding it necessarily, but maybe she just didn't mention it, or maybe she wasn't thinking about it in her argument. She doesn't outright exclude it, even though I guess based on her wording, she kind of excludes it. But I like C better because C is more general and fits better, right? Because C is just saying, well, he introduces something that questions Sarah's assumptions. And I think Sarah's assumption is that, well, if you've been forced to do it, you're not gonna end up enjoying it almost, right? That's implicit in her argument, because she says, well, there's no way this policy can succeed by itself. But Paul is saying, well, maybe people can learn to enjoy it, right? And so I think C would be the answer for this one, but B is not B is not a terrible one either. It's just C is better.